Hey everybody. This is the foreword and like the opening stuff from Maurice Godelier's Rationality and Irrationality in Economics, translated from the French by Brian Pearce. Looks like this book was published in 1972, or translated, the English version, 1972. And the table of contents are forward to the English language edition from 1972, which I'm going to be reading in this video. Part 1 of the book is titled The Theme, and the sections are the starting point, the rationality of economic systems, a question of ideology or a scientific problem, rationality of agents and rationality of systems, a formal and a material definition of the economy, two ideological answers to the problem, Adam Smith and Oscar Lange, economic rationality and rationality of economic science, subject matter and theoretical conditions of this inquiry, capitalist economic rationality, the rational entrepreneur, the rational worker, the rational consumer, rationality of the capitalist system, perfect competition, equilibrium, Pareto optimum, welfare, the duality theorem and the innocence of mathematics, the role of supply and demand in the Marxist theory of value and prices, two conceptions of contradiction in Marx's Capital, quote, necessity and superiority, end quote, of socialism, science, ideology, humanism, the fundamental difference between Hegel's dialectic and Marx's, the conceptions of correspondence and of hierarchy of structures, distance covered. Part 2 of the book is titled The Rationality of Economic Theory, and this looks like it actually has chapters. Chapter 1, Political Economy and Philosophy, with the headings, Where had Marx got in 1843? What Pearce gave Marx? The 1844 manuscripts. Is Marx already a Marxist? The alliance with Engels, the Holy Family. Chapter 2, The Structures of the Method of Capital. Section 1, The Hypothetico-Deductive Method. The use of assumptions, the deductive operations. Section 2, the dialectical method, the object of the dialectic. Section 3, the dialectic as an operational field, use of the dialectical method in capital, the study of the process of the circulation of capital. Capital is not a, quote, thing, end quote, at rest, but a reality in movement. The specific role of the circuit of productive capital, the basis of the system's dynamic, relations between economic theory and historical reality, relations between economic theory and historical science. Section 4, the external contradiction of capitalism. Section 5, the internal contradiction of capitalism and the fundamental laws of the dynamic of the system. Section 6, conclusion, the method of capital as a synthetic unity of the two methods, the dialectical method, the hypothetico-deductive method, the linking and synthesis of the two methods, notes on the simplifying assumptions. Chapter 3, some aspects of the method of Marx's Capital. 4, the measurement of value, a problem of optimum management in a socialist economy. Chapter 5, the marginalist and the Marxist theories of value and prices, some hypotheses. Part 3 of the book is titled The Rationality of Economic Systems, the object and method of economic anthropology. Chapter 1, the idea of an economic system and analysis of its working, the domain of the, quote, economic, the idea of a, quote, system, the laws of the functioning of a system, the formal model of a possible economic system, the structures of production, the structures of distribution, the structures of consumption. Chapter 2, the problem of a, quote, general theory and of the right to, quote, extend the categories and laws of political economy. 3, towards a renovation of the idea of, quote, economic rationality. Index. And here we are to the foreword to the English edition, which is titled Functionalism, Structuralism, and Marxism. And the first section is titled The Scope of the Question and the Course Followed. When this book was published in 1966, it offered an interim report on a task of research that had been begun in 1958 with the aim of finding the answer to two questions which are really only a single question. Quote, what is the rationality of the economic systems that appear and disappear throughout history? In other words, what is their hidden logic and the underlying necessity of them to exist or to have existed, and what are the conditions needed for a rational understanding of these systems? In other words, for a fully developed comparative economic science, end quote. Here was a question that, though precise, led me into a field of research that seemed unlimited, being defined by no boundaries either de jure or de facto. A question the vastness of which showed clearly enough that it had been advanced by a philosopher, that is, by a mind given to focusing directly upon basic truths, concerned with the foundations of reality and how we know them. At the same time, however, and here the philosopher who put forward this huge question showed that he was no longer a philosopher of the traditional sort, but a Marxist. The answer to this question was not sought in philosophy or by philosophical means, but in and through examining the knowledge accumulated by the sciences and a variety of theoretical methods. Hence the strange journey from philosophy to economics, and then to anthropology, the stages of which are indicated by the text assembled in this book. I thus had twice to apply myself to learning a new theoretical method, and to endeavoring to find out if the question of rationality still meant something, and what the new forms were which it presented itself. If, however, it proved necessary to go beyond political economy to anthropology, this was because political economy, as political economy exists today, restricts political economy itself to analyzing two contemporary economic systems, and for it the question of economic, quote, rationality, end quote, leads ineluctably to this assertion, increasingly supported by, quote, proofs of the superiority of one system over the other, and the necessity for one of the systems, this one or that system, to vanquish the other in the course of historical development. I therefore had to subject to critical examination the, quote, evidence, end quote, adduced by the advocates of each system, and to seek the conditions needed if this evidence was to contribute scientific and not ideological proof. In this search for the epistemological conditions of a rigorous proof, one conclusion became obvious at an early stage, namely that the question of the, quote, rationality, end quote, of a system means primarily the question of the, quote, historical necessity, end quote, for its existence. In other words, in order to think out this question, one has to construct the theory of the conditions for the system's appearance and development, something that is usually excluded from or kept outside the field of research of political economy and left to the, quote, historians, end quote, of economic life. A second conclusion emerges as an extension of the first conclusion. The conditions for the rise, functioning, and evolution of any system are twofold, some belonging to the sphere of men's intentional activity, while others, of more decisive importance, give expression to the unintentional properties inherent in social relations, properties that do not belong to men's consciousness, having neither their origin nor their basis in that sphere, and that are latent with the possibility of transforming these social relations. If, however, economic and social systems are mutually contradictory, and if each of them develops and changes and eventually vanishes from history, this is because no system exists or can reproduce itself elsewhere than within definite limits, by way of transformations that are compatible with the unintentional properties of its inner structures, these limits being merely the ways in which these unintentional properties and the relations of functional compatibility and incompatibility determined by them or manifested. It was therefore necessary to bring these concepts of compatibility, incompatibility, and limits into relation with the concept of contradiction and the concepts of systems theory and cybernetics. This was how I started on my investigation of the concepts of correspondence and contradiction between structures, and my criticism of ideas derived either from Hegel or from Marx, as he has been misrepresented by dogmatic Marxism. The ultimate question still stood, however, is there an ultimate reason? Is there an ultimate reason, an ultimate basis for the transformations that economic systems undergo? Transformations that are governed by the relations of compatibility and incompatibility between the structures composing these systems. And since, unless we are to assume that history is given meaning from outside itself and is driven by some a priori purpose, this basis has to be looked for within the various types of relations that obtain among men. The question then becomes, which, among these relations, are the ones that bear primary responsibility for the major transformations that occur in the history of mankind, determining them in the last analysis. Among the possible answers to this question, we know the one offered by Marx, the relations that men form among themselves in order to carry out, in the process of carrying out, the production of the material conditions of their existence, determine, in the last analysis, the relations of compatibility and incompatibility between all levels of social life, and therefore it is the major transformations that take place in the material conditions of their existence that determine, in the last analysis, the outstanding transformations that occur in the forms and functions of the other levels of social life, political, ideological, etc. There seemed, however, to be an unavoidable objection to this answer offered by Marx. How could this hypothesis be reconciled with the fact, for example, that within many primitive societies it is relations of kinship between men that dominate social organization? Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, or that religious relations seem to dominate Indian society, dividing men into a hierarchy of caste in accordance with an ideology of purity and impurity. Louis Dumont. Thus, unless facts were to be dogmatically denied and treated as hallucinations, the Marx is problematic in the sphere of economic and social science, concerned with accounting for the existence and variety of societies, and their history became, how are we to conceive the relations between the determining structure and the dominant one, and what determining power in economic relations is it that dictates that there shall be dominance by kinship relations or by politico-religious relations? This question could not be answered or even asked by dogmatic Marxism and the other forms of that vulgar materialism to which dogmatic Marxism belongs, even though it denies the affinity. For vulgar materialism, the economy, which vulgar materialism reduces to the relations between technology and environment, quote, produces, unquote, the given society, giving rise to it as an epiphenomenon. This means refusing to see the irreducible differences between the levels and structures of social life, the reason for the relative autonomy with which they operate, and reducing all levels to so many functions, either apparent or concealed, of economic activity. One example will suffice to show the dead end that vulgar materialism plunges into, thus enabling various idealist theories of society and history to triumph over its helplessness. In kinship relations, whatever form they may take, there is an element that can never be reduced to a mere economic relation, or deduced exclusively from such a relation. This is the relation between individuals of opposite sexes who cooperate in a socially regulated relationship, namely marriage, to ensure the biological reproduction of society. Clearly, it depends on definite conditions of the production of material existence, whether the division between sexes is or is not the dominant form of the division of labor, and whether it is relations of consanguinity within a group or marriage relations between groups that constitute the means of direct cooperation in production or indirect cooperation in the circulation of goods. But from the outset, kinship relations are not reduced to the effecting of these functions alone, and for this reason it is not possible simply to, quote, deduce, end quote, then, from the latter. It therefore seems clear to me that only if we radically reject vulgar materialism can we hope to tackle correctly the task of analyzing the relations between determination and dominance, and so to establish, so far as some societies are concerned, the working of the structural causality of their various modes of production in relation to their organization and evolution. These theoretical conclusions, and the need to apply them to modes of production and forms of society, differ from the ones examined by political economy, inevitably led me towards that scientific activity which, of all the, quote, humane sciences, deals with the largest number of living economic and social systems which still retain, despite the varying extent of the transformations in them dictated by the invention, direct or indirect, of the capitalist and socialist systems, some essential elements of their earlier way of functioning. For this reason, the survival within a number of contemporary societies of non-capitalist elements, which are alive but which seem, at first sight, to the European investigator to be odd or even absurd, I was drawn toward a scientific activity that requires of the researcher, from the outset, a degree of detachment from the facts, history and ideology of his own society much greater than that required of the historian or economist studying Western societies, insofar as these investigators have the impression, usually illusory, of possessing greater familiarity with what they are studying, a prior knowledge of their field work which causes them to affect not so much cognition as recognition, comparable to the cognition of essences in Plato's philosophy. The scientific activity exists and is called, quote, anthropology. This scientific activity exists and is called, quote, anthropology, end quote. I therefore became an anthropologist. I was unable, however, given my wish to analyze economic and social systems in such a way that their unintentional social structures should become apparent, to adopt the standpoint of structural anthropology, since I realized that structuralism was no more competent than functionalism, though for different reasons, to work out the theory of the conditions needed for the historical appearance and disappearance of the system it studies, that is, to form a conception of history. From the outset, I rejected the dilemma of, quote, anthropology versus history, end quote, as put forward in differing forms by Boas, Lowy, Goldenweiser, Leach, or Levi-Strauss. In association with Professor Levi-Strauss, who took a close interest in my project and obtained for me all the facilities I needed in order to carry it out, I therefore undertook to initiate myself into anthropology, while devoting special attention to what is called, quote, economic anthropology, end quote, the field that it seemed ought to include the data of my theoretical problems and perhaps the elements of their solution. This meant, apparently, turning away from analysis of the realities and problems of our own society. But very soon I rediscovered these realities present at the very heart of the theory and practice of anthropology. After completing an initial survey of the methodological problems of economic anthropology, I set forth to serve my apprenticeship, quote, in the field, end quote, among the Baruya, a tribe living in the interior of New Guinea, who had seen a white man for the first time only in 1951 and had been brought under effective supervision by the Australian administration so recently as 1960, 6 years before my arrival among them. I remained there from 1967 to 1969. The Baruya are a tribe of slash-and-burn cultivators who had, in about 1950, given up using their former tools of stone and bamboo in favor of axes and machetes made of steel, which came to them through the channels of their old established intertribal trade from those parts of the island where the white men were already present and dominant. This replacement of factors of production had been undertaken of their own free will, without pressure from white administrators or missionaries, since they had not yet been discovered by the latter. History thus presented itself by way of exception with a remarkable case of, quote, abridgment, end quote, canceling before our very eyes in a few isolated valleys amid the mountains of New Guinea the enormous distance that separates in space and time two extreme forms of historical development: a primitive society which had hardly emerged from the Neolithic stage, when it found itself confronted by foreigners who claimed the, quote, right, in the name of the, quote, superiority of their social system and their values, to, quote, pacify the society by military means, to, quote, civilize the society, and to turn it into a matter for anthropological study. In short, to subject it thenceforth to the order of the European world, not of Herodotus or of Cortes, but of lunar exploration and imperialist war. Straight away the question of the, quote, rationality, end quote, of economic and social systems and of history arose in its entirety. But now in the setting of the live and painful coming together of two of these systems, grasped through the field work which is the craft of the anthropologist, a craft that had to be performed as it actually exists, inevitably surrounded from the start and from within, by the problems that are dictated by history, the history of today, but also that of yesterday. Once again, the, quote, question of rationality, end quote, arose as one which science cannot, quote, dodge in any way, and which does not disengage the work that produces scientific knowledge from the present or from reality, and does not sever the close link that binds together today, yesterday, and tomorrow, like the near and far. This was the theoretical scope of my investigation of economic rationality, and these are the courses I followed in investigating it. I appreciate that what I have accomplished is only a few very short journeys, resulting in isolated discoveries in a vast area, the systematic exploration of which calls for cooperation between great numbers of researchers. There is something, though, which matters more than the number of researchers, and which at the same time promises to attract these in ever-growing numbers, namely the need to carry out a theoretical revolution in the humane sciences, a revolution that becomes daily more urgent if we are to rescue these sciences from the dead ends of functionalist empiricism or the helplessness of structuralism in face of history. It seems to me that such a revolution must today proceed by way of the reconstruction of these sciences on the basis of a Marxism that has been radically purged of all traces of vulgar materialism and dogmatism. If this revolution is accomplished, the unresolved problems that are piling up will find their solution. And while it is the chief purpose of a revolution to solve problems, we must nevertheless not overlook the fact that one of the means and effects of this transformation is the subjection to criticism from the new point of view of the old approaches and methods that are still dominant in the field of humane sciences. The remainder of this foreword will be devoted to outlining some of these essential criticisms. New section. Some critical effects of questioning the rationality of economic and social systems. These critical effects necessarily take three directions: criticism of Hegel's dialectics, criticism of empiricism, above all functionalist empiricism, and criticism of structuralism. The need to conceptualize the relations of incompatibility between structures, to find out why there are limits to the possible transformations of these structures, limits beyond which the reproduction of a system becomes compromised or even impossible, necessarily led me to reflection about dialectics, all about Hegel's dialectics, since for many Marxists the dialectics of Marx and of Hegel are identical at the level of principles, with their different bases, materialist or idealist, merely changing their application without changing their laws. As a result of my analysis, I think I have shown that the basis of Hegelian idealism, the postulate that matter is is thought in itself, which does not conceive itself, and so thought which is both itself and its opposite, which was directly expressed in the first principle of Hegelian dialectics, the postulate of the identity of opposites, does not belong to science but to metaphysics. All that belongs to the realm of scientific thought is the principle of the unity of opposites, which enables us to grasp at once their complementarity, their compatibility, and their compatibility, and opposites necessary conflict, opposites incompatibility, and the capacity that exists for reproduction of this unity within certain limits. Far from contradicting the recent discoveries of cybernetics or systems theory, Marxist dialectics, stripped of its equivocal and distorting affinity to Hegel's, appears as an abstract tool of positive value, which has now been enriched, in a sense, by mathematical research on the theory of systems and their internal regulation. Without this radical criticism of the connection between principle and content in Hegel's dialectics, dialectics must remain what it has been up to now, a, quote, device for proving anything and everything, end quote, alien to and repudiated by science. This has obliged me to come out against the ambiguous formulations of Lenin, Mao Zedong, or such Marxists as Lucien Sèvres, and to consider the thesis of Louis Althusser, according to which the basic difference between Hegel's dialectics and the dialectics of Marx lies in the fact that in Hegel, contradiction is always simple, but in Marx is, quote, overdetermined, end quote. As an achievement that is positive but secondary, positive insofar as it implies and shows that it is impossible to reduce the different instances of society one to another, but secondary in that it does not bring out the radically, quote, metaphysical and non-scientific nature of the first principle of the Wissenschaft der Logik, the principle of the identity of opposites. The master is not the slave, the employer is not the worker, even if the one cannot exist without the other, and this relation even opposes them one to the other just as much as it unites them. Was it necessary, then, in order to get back to the facts of reality, to return to empiricism? But to what kind of empiricism? To abstract empiricism or to functionalist empiricism? Whether in its ideal form, e.g. in anthropology, the trend called, quote, cultural anthropology, end quote, or is it its materialist form, e.g. the, quote, cultural ecology, end quote, upheld by Marvin Harris. The essential weakness of abstract empiricism is well known. The individual is taken as the starting point of science, but in fact it is easy to show that this principle is violated as soon as formulated. We need only mention Walras' model of a pure economy, which serves as paradigm of the neoclassical theory of the optimum conditions for the functioning of a market economy that maintains itself in a state of equilibrium. This analysis proceeds from the existence of abstract individuals endowed with certain scales, whether transitive or intransitive, of subjective preferences, and with a psychology, simple but, quote, natural, that consists of a tendency to maximize their satisfactions. It is then assumed that these individuals, who are so many embodiments of a theoretical fetish, the eternal homo economists, live in a world where they cannot but compete with each other. It then remains to be ascertained how these individuals, who are assumed, and this is another fantastical assumption, to face each other with equal resources and information, will have to go about exchanging their labor and their products so as to maximize their satisfactions. It is clear from this summary that to start from the individual is always to make a false start, giving oneself a false picture, for one has immediately, even though surreptitiously, place these individuals in a universe which, though certainly abstract, possesses the very form of capitalist economy, being formally determined and organized by certain principles, which are those of the capitalist mode of production. A. Every product, including labor power, is an exchangeable commodity. B. Relations between all the individuals are relations of commodity exchange. C. Exchange relations are relations of competition. The dispute between formalists and substantivists in economic anthropology about the subject matter of political economy now becomes understandable. For the formalists, footnote, e.g. Leclerc, Bunting, Salisbury, who follow Lionel Robbins and Samuelson, see Lionel Robbins, The Subject Matter of Economics, and are so linked with the conservative majority of the economists of the capitalist countries, economics studies merely the forms of behavior of individuals seeking to maximize their satisfaction. For the substantivists, following Karl Polanyi, economics deals with social relations that are bound up with the production of material means of existence, social relations of which capitalist commodity economy is only one example among others. This definition reproduces that given by the classical economists and opposes the marginalist definition, but it is the one that, in reality, all economists apply in their practice. This is why the dispute about the definition of what is economic has only a limited significance, since as soon as they have left behind them the discussion about the definition, both substantivists and formalists can find themselves in agreement on the essential definitions of non-Marxist political economy, concerning the conceptions of value, wages, profit, price, etc. And it is about these definitions that the basic disputes are carried on in economic science, and in relation to them that non-Marxist and Marxist assumptions and analyses confront each other. This analysis could be pursued to show how Pareto came on the scene to make Walras' model more effective by eliminating one of Walras' model's weak points, namely the restrictive assumption of equality in information and a means of production possessed by all the individuals who come face to face in a competitive market. By showing that an optimum could be attained even in a situation where there was inequality and appropriation of the means of production, Pareto introduced into Walras' model the very form of the fundamental social relation of the capitalist mode of production, which is not merely a generalized commodity economy in which every product is exchanged as a commodity, but a capitalist commodity economy, that is, one that assumes the fundamental inequality between a class which owns money and means of production, and another class which is without these, and is regularly to sell to the former the use of its labor power. An economic doctrine which sought to be the, quote, pure science of fundamental laws of economy was able to develop, by a paradox that was perfectly predictable, only through jettisoning its point of departure, namely the existence of abstract and equal individuals, so as to reintroduce clandestinely the existence of concrete social relations, the necessary relation of inequality between two classes, necessary in two ways, because it is how the system functions and is reproduced, and because it is dictated by a history which economic science is incapable or not desirous of analyzing. Pure neoclassical economics is thus a committed economics through and through, both in the questions it asks and in those it fails to ask, committed to legitimizing and reproducing the capitalist system, and the refinements of econometry and mathematical research can never change this in the least. This was recognized in his own way by one of the greatest of the econometricians, T.C. Koopmans, when he wrote, with lucidity and prudence, commenting on the apologetical discourse of some of his colleagues, quote, a competitive equilibrium, even if that competitive equilibrium is also a Pareto optimum, may involve more unequal distribution of income than is regarded as desirable from a social point of view. The concept of a Pareto optimum is insensitive to this consideration, and in that respect, the term, quote, optimum, end quote, is a misnomer, end quote. T.C. Koopmans. Actually, this discussion is not only of interest to economists. What is fundamental to the debate is that there is no direct experience between individuals except through the social relations that, quote, mediate them. And this is why it is of interest to all the humane sciences alike. The concept of, quote, immediate experience is scientifically meaningless. And this is why science cannot take the individual and the individual's, quote, immediate experience of the world and other people as its point of departure. This principle is explicitly acknowledged by functionalism, by structuralism, and by Marxism. The work of such anthropologists as Mary Douglas or Colin Turnbull shows clearly enough that we have to push analysis to the point where analysis explains the form that the relations existing among men and between men and nature assumes in the consciousness of individuals, and also that this form, far from explaining these relations, itself needs to be explained on the basis of them by means of a method that enables one at the same time to compare various societies and their symbolic functions. Functionalist empiricism, however, starts not from individuals but from the relations between individuals. These relations are not taken one by one but together, and this group of relations is regarded as a, quote, integrated, end quote, whole, to the extent that these different relations are functionally complementary. These functions determine the role and status of individuals in their social systems, and this system constantly tends towards a state of equilibrium. Study of a society thus means study of a system, of a totality that is functionally integrated and that reproduces itself as such. Knowing the history of this system does not help one to know how it functions. History itself appears as a, quote, succession of accidental events, end quote, which are left to the ethnologist or the historian, while theoretical analysis of the systems is reserved for the anthropologist or sociologist. These views are well known, and it is unnecessary to do more than refer the reader to the classical writings of Radcliffe Brown and Nadell, or for sociology, to the work of Talcott Parsons. What structuralists and Marxism alike reject is not, of course, the principle that science must take as its subject of analysis the relations between men, or the principle that relations must be analyzed in their unity within a whole, or the principle that priority must be given to studying the logic of these relations and this whole before studying their origin and evolution. Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown were right to turn away from that pseudo-history, the evolutionism of 19th century, which saw in a given society a collection of customs inherited from a past period that one reconstituted by means of assumptions that were unverified and often unverifiable, and instead to study the facts themselves as they presented themselves before their eyes. I've shown elsewhere that Marx, turning his back on the, quote, historicist, end quote, method, dealt with the origin of the capitalist mode of production and only after studying the capitalist mode of production's internal logic and establishing his theory of value and surplus value, and have shown that this methodological principle of priority for the analysis of a structure over that of its origin is the principle of modern linguistics and of Levi-Strauss, even though Levi-Strauss, unlike Marx, accepts the empiricist view that history is a, quote, succession of accidental events, end quote. What both structuralists and Marxists reject are the empiricist definitions of what constitutes a social structure. For Radcliffe, Brown, and Nadell, a social structure is an aspect of reality itself. A social structure is order, the ordering of the visible relations between men, and ordering that explains the logic of the complementariness of these visible relations. For others, and despite his criticism of functionalism, Leach is the best example of these. The structure is an ideal order which the mind introduces into things by reducing the multiform flux of reality to simplified images that give one a hold upon reality and make possible social action, social practice. Footnote. Quote, I hold that social structure in practical situations, as contrasted with the sociologist's abstract model, consists of a set of ideas about the distribution of power between persons and groups of persons, end quote. Leach. Then, referring to the models constructed by sociologists and anthropologists, Leach adds this definition of an orthodox functionalism. Quote, social structure, the principles of organization that unite the component parts of the system, end quote, and concludes with a subjectivist pirouette. Quote, the structures which the anthropologist describes are models which exist only as logical constructions in the anthropologist's own mind, end quote. Leach. End footnote. For Marx, as for Levi-Strauss, a structure is not a reality that is directly visible and so directly observable, but a level of reality that exists beyond the visible relations between men, and the functioning of which constitutes the underlying logic of the system, the subjacent order by which the apparent order is to be explained. Let me recall the insistence with which Levi-Strauss returns to this essential point, combating the idealistic and formalistic interpretations to which Levi-Strauss's ideas are commonly subjected. In his reply to Maybury Lewis, Levi-Strauss emphasizes the fact that, quote, of course the final word should rest with experience. However, the experiment suggested and guided by deductive reasoning will not be the same as the unsophisticated ones with which the whole process started. The ultimate proof of the molecular structure of matter is provided by the electronic microscope, which enables us to see actual molecules. This achievement does not alter the fact that henceforth the molecule will not become any more visible to the naked eye. Similarly, it is hopeless to expect a structural analysis to change our way of perceiving concrete social relations. It will only explain concrete social relations better, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Introducing to the public the first volume of Mythologique, Levi-Strauss again declared categorically, quote, I have thus completed my demonstration of the fact that, whereas in the public mind there is frequently the confusion between structuralism, idealism, and formalism, structuralism has only to be confronted with two manifestations of idealism and forms for its own deterministic and realistic inspiration to become clearly manifest, end quote. Levi-Strauss. The idealist and formalist interpretations of structuralism are based on the opening sentence of the well-known passage from Levi-Strauss devoted to the concept of social structure. Quote, passing now to the task of defining, quote, social structure, end quote, there is a point which should be cleared up immediately. The term, quote, social structure, end quote, has nothing to do with empirical reality, but with models which are built up after empirical reality, end quote, Levi-Strauss. This sentence, taken out of its context, conveys the illusion that the theoretical positions of Levi-Strauss and Leach are identical, or at least are fundamentally linked. But Levi-Strauss's sentence cannot be interpreted correctly unless it is taken in relation to the sentence that follows. Quote, social relations consist of the raw material out of which the models making up the social structure are built. End quote. Levi-Strauss. To make a structure, quote, manifest, unquote, does not mean creating the structure out of nothing or assuming that the structure exists only in the human mind, either in the form of models indigenous to social reality or in that of the abstract models of the sociologists. To sum up this complex group of theoretical positions and oppositions as simply as possible, let me say that Levi-Strauss affirms, like Radcliffe Brown, the, quote, reality, end quote, of social structures as existing outside the human mind, and so opposes Leach. But Levi-Strauss at the same time opposes Radcliffe Brown, since, for him, the reality of a social structure is not the, quote, ordering, end quote, of the social relations that are directly observable by the informant or the anthropologist. Footnote. This is a criticism that Meyer-Fortes directs at Radcliffe Brown when he wrote in 1949 in the Radcliffe Brown Festschrift, quote, structure is not immediately visible in the, quote, concrete reality, end quote. ... When we describe structure, we are, as it were, in the realm of grammar and syntax, not of the spoken word, end quote. Myers-Fortes. And footnote. Where am I? He is thus led to criticize functionalism for its inability to grasp the order underlying visible social relations and construct a solid base for a comparative science of societies. Consequently, he finds himself side by side with Leach, who also criticizes the truisms of functionalism, but moves in the opposite direction from Levi-Strauss, towards a formalism that keeps intact the empiricist view of reality as a multiform, unstructured flux. It is understandable that such an interplay of agreement and disagreement at different levels should naturally give rise to confusions and misconceptions in the social science field, which make it both difficult and necessary for researchers to undertake a critical analysis of the epistemological conditions and principles of their methods of cognition. Footnote, this is how it is that Edmund Leach appears in the eyes of his Anglo-American colleagues as the isolated but turbulent representative of structuralism, and he himself declares his, quote, sympathy with his, parenthesis, Levi-Strauss's, end parenthesis, general point of view, end quote, and Leach's, quote, obvious debt, end quote, to Levi-Strauss, end footnote. This is why a thorough analysis of the relations between structuralism and Marxism presents itself as a fundamental task, since it is possible for a radical difference in opposition to exist beneath, within, and within a common acceptance of certain methodological principles and a common affirmation that science must be materialistic and deterministic. Let's recall once again that what these points of agreement are. There is first the methodological principle that social relations must be analyzed as forming, quote, systems, end quote. Then there is the principle that the inner logic of these systems must be analyzed before their origin is analyzed. We see at once that, as regards these two principles, Marxism is not opposed either to structuralism or to functionalism. These two principles are set forth in Marx's methodological introduction to his contribution to the critique of political economy, where Marx defines the order in which it is necessary to study and expound the way the capitalist mode of production works. Quote, rent cannot be understood without capital, but capital can be understood without rent. Capital is the economic power that dominates everything in bourgeois society. Capital must form both the point of departure and the conclusion, and capital has to be expounded before landed property. After analyzing capital and landed property separately, their interconnection must be examined. Quote, I don't know, I guess there's a quote that started and it didn't end, but it seems like this is another quote, or it might be a continuation, I'm not sure. It would be inexpedient and wrong, therefore, to present the economic categories successively, in the order in which the economic categories have played their dominant role in history. On the contrary, their order of succession is determined by their mutual relation in modern bourgeois society, and this is quite the reverse of what appears to be natural to them or in accordance with the sequence of historical development. On the contrary, their order of succession is determined by their mutual relation in modern bourgeois society, and this is quite the reverse of what appears to be natural to them or in accordance with the sequence of historical development. The point at issue is not the role that various economic relations have played in the succession of various social formations appearing in the course of history, even less is it their sequence as, quote, concepts, and, quote, pardon, parenthesis, a nebulous notion of the historical process, end parenthesis, but their position, the category's position, within modern bourgeois society, end quote. Marx, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Marx does not make the question of the origin or the history of social relations the key question or principal question for science, as did the evolutionists and diffusionists of the 19th century. Marx's thinking on this point converges with that of Malinowski or of Levi-Strauss. This accounts for the existence of a text such as Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, in which Marx, having discovered the true hidden nature of surplus value, turns back to the history of antiquity and the Middle Ages and analyzes the differences between various archaic or ancient modes of production and the capitalist mode. This is the underlying reason for the internal structure of capital, as well as for the existence of texts like Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, and also the drafts of Marx's letter to Vera Sasulich from the 8th of March 1881. In Capital, it is only after establishing that the content of the exchange value of commodities is socially necessary labor time, and that capital is not a thing but a social relation between two classes, one of which appropriates the value created by the other, surplus value, that Marx turns to the problem of the origins of capitalism and deals with it under the title of, quote, the primitive accumulation of capital, end quote. In Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, the book, Marx had gone beyond the question of the origins of capitalism. It outlined, writing as historian and anthropologist, a remarkable analysis of the original logics of the functioning of certain ancient and archaic modes of production, endeavoring to imagine some of the conditions of their internal transformations and their history. Marx's method in relation to history can be grasped very clearly in the passage Marx devoted to defining the nature of money as a commodity, specialized in the function of expressing the value of other commodities as, quote, universal equivalent, unquote. When Marx says that he is going to show, quote, the genesis of the money form, end quote, of exchange value, what he does is to determine at one and the same time the specific function of one particular category of commodities in relation to all the others, the, quote, form, end quote, that a commodity has to assume in order to fulfill this specialized function as universal equivalent, and the practical conditions that make both necessary and possible the specialization of a certain category of commodities in this function. And Marx emphasizes that this theoretical procedure, which he calls the, quote, ideal genesis, end quote, of money, is not at all a, quote, history, end quote, of the different forms of money that are encountered in human societies. Such a, quote, history, end quote, is possible and can be scientific only on the basis of results. One, by preliminary structural research, and the results of these historical researches will also contribute to the development of structural research. In this circular movement of cognition, the starting point of which is always analysis of functions, and of the structures that realize them and define conditions, a single science of man is constituted, which does not isolate enclosed fetishized compartments, or oppose to each other ethnology and anthropology, history and theory, etc. The method like this, which aims at grasping simultaneously the basis, the raison d'etre of the functions, the form and the conditions of existence, and so the rise and evolution of social relations, which thereby exist only as structures endowed with objective properties, lays down rigorous lines for a new and fruitful relation between scientific disciplines, both the different departments of history, economic, political, social, ideological, cognitive activities, etc., and what are called the theoretical disciplines, anthropology, sociology, political economy, etc. After that has been established, the functionalist view may cease to be true, or to seem true, according to which, quote, the historian can only provide us with the succession of accidental events which have caused a society to become what it is. End quote. This is how Evans Pritchard sums up the attitude of the functionalist towards history without, however, endorsing it himself. End footnote. But the functionalist criticism of the historian's work, a criticism to which Marx subscribed in advance when he himself criticized the, quote, historians, end quote, of capitalism or of antiquity, goes further than a mere criticism of the present state of theoretical method, a situation that one may still hope and endeavor to improve. Beyond the criticism of history as a craft, historiography, there is the empiricist view that history as reality, Geschichte, is only a succession of, quote, events, and of events that are themselves only, quote, accidents. On this fundamental point concerning not just the epistemological conditions of a science of history, but the nature of the actual process of human history, Marx is opposed both to Radcliffe Brown and to Leach or Levi-Strauss. I shall come back to this point. Before doing so, however, let me recall a third methodological principle which opposes Marxism and structuralism to functionalist empiricism, namely that what is visible is a reality concealing another. Deeper reality, which is hidden and the discovery of which is the very purpose of scientific cognition. We are here at the very heart of Marx's method as displayed in Capital, at the point of origin of the theoretical revolution Marx effected in political economy and in the humane sciences. Footnote, let me recall on this crucial point there is a disagreement among the functionalists. Evans Pritchard stresses, for instance, that, quote, history is not merely a succession of changes, but a growth. Furthermore, history alone provides a satisfactory experimental situation in which the hypotheses of functional anthropology can be tested, end quote. Evans Pritchard. End footnote. Actually, I think that footnote was earlier than the last sentence that I just said from the body text. But that's okay. What is this method? Marx shows the absurd, falsely, quote, obvious, end quote, character of the conceptions that individuals spontaneously form regarding the nature of commodities and of economic relations in commodity societies. Quote, a commodity appears at first sight as a very trivial thing and easily understood, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx shows that the reason why a commodity is a complex and obscure reality is that what makes a product of labor a commodity, namely the commodity's value, is social labor that does not appear as such. Social labor that does not appear as such. Quote, the existence of the things qua commodities and the value relation between the products of labor, which stamp these things as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There it is a definite social relation between men that assumes in men's eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relation with both one another and the human race. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. The fetishizing of commodities is not the effect of the alienation of consciousness, but the effect in and for consciousness. The effect in and for consciousness of the disguising of social relations in and behind social relations appearances. Now these appearances are the necessary point of departure for the representations of their economic relations that individuals spontaneously form of themselves. Such images thus constitute a more or less coherent body of illusory beliefs concerning the social reality within which these individuals live, and serve them as means of acting within and upon this social reality. We see the full implication of the social sciences of Marx's demonstration of the existence of a process of fetishization of social relations, a demonstration carried out on the basis of the particular example provided by the fetishizing of commodity relations of production. Footnote, I had tried to analyze other forms of fetishism connected with non-commodity modes of production in an article from 1970 and in an article devoted to Levi-Strauss's books, Le Pensée Sauvage and Mythologique. End footnote. In showing that by his labor the worker creates not only the equivalent of the value represented by his wages, but also additional value, for which he is not paid, and which constitutes the origin and essence of surplus value, Marx shows at the same time that in practice the wage relation, quote, makes the actual relation invisible, and indeed shows the direct opposite of that relation, end quote. Marx. Thus, at the level of visible social relations, everything happens in the eyes of both the capitalists and the workers, as though wages paid for all the labor contributed by the worker and profit were not produced by labor, but by capital. The economic categories of wages, profit, interest on capital, etc., therefore express quite well the visible relations of the capitalist system, and as such they have pragmatic utility. Pragmatic utility, being of service in management and the taking of decisions, but they possess no scientific value, for they do not reflect the true underlying logic of the system. No econometrical refinements can alter this fact, which does not at all signify that the use of mathematics does not increase the pragmatic utility of the categories of vulgar economics, insofar as, at the level of the day-to-day practice of business management of enterprises and competition, what is essential is not to have a scientific theory of the real functioning of the system in its totality, but to anticipate the functioning of variables, wages, investments, profits, which must and can be treated separately. Quote, the final pattern of economic relations, as seen on the surface in their real existence, and consequently in the conceptions by which the bearers and agents of these relations seek to understand them, is very much different from, and indeed quite the reverse, of their inner but concealed essential pattern and the conception corresponding to it. Their inner but concealed essential pattern and the conception corresponding to it. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. It is therefore impossible for scientific cognition to be built up from the spontaneous representations formed by individuals of their social relations, and this radically refutes empiricism in all the fields where it operates. There is no fundamental difference between the spontaneous models of their society that individuals make for themselves. Quote, the set of ideas, end quote, they have regarding their, quote, social structure and practical situations, end quote. Leach. And the learned methods constructed by sociologists and economists who start from the same spontaneous representations and whose models, quote, exist only as logical constructions, in bracket their, and bracket own mind, end quote. Leach. On this point, Marx and Levi-Strauss are agreed, and the latter's analysis of the mechanisms by which mythical representations of reality are constructed is an essential scientific gain. However, Marx requires of science that it not merely discover the mechanisms of mythical thought, but also the mechanisms which, existing outside of thought, impose upon the latter the illusory conceptions which it forms of reality, that is to say, both their content and their historical necessity. Quote, it is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of the mystic creations of religion than, conversely, it is to develop from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestialized forms of these relations. The latter method is the only materialistic and therefore the only scientific one. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. It is the actual significance of the structural analysis of myths and of all ideology that is called in question by this reflection of Marx's on the history of religion. Before putting our analysis of the difference and opposition between Marxism and Structuralism, let me mention an important consequence of the Marxist criticism of, quote, bourgeois political economy and of its empiricist premises. The most abstract categories of political economy, those which seem most innocent of any ideological content, constitute only abstract cognition of the determinations that are common to all societies, and not real cognition of the specific structures of these societies. The establishment of the individual as a mere worker is itself a product of historical development. Quote, labor is quite a simple category. The idea of labor in that sense as labor in general is also very old. Yet, quote, labor, end quote, thus defined by political economy, is as much a modern category as the conditions which have given rise to this simple abstraction. ... This example of labor strikingly shows how even the most abstract categories, in spite of their applicability to all epochs, just because of their abstract character, or by the very definiteness of the abstraction, a product of historical conditions as well, and are fully applicable only to and under those conditions. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. This analysis, which would not be repudiated by anthropologists, shows well enough the extent to which abstract categories such as, quote, economy, religion, politics, seen as so many subsystems of a social system, Talcott Parsons, contain strictly the apparent form of the social relations of capitalist society. In the latter, the economy seems to function in a purely autonomous way, independently of political and religious relations, which are seen as, quote, exogenous, end quote, variables. Authentic Marxism, however, does not prejudge the form and content of real economic relations in the various societies known to history. Their modes of production are not objects available for direct cognition through experience, but realities which have to be, quote, recognized, and, quote, by discovering them where the vulgar and abstract conceptions of economy and society do not accompany them. That is, also in the functioning of political or religious or kinship relations. A mode of production is not reducible to the subsistence activities of society, but a complex reality that has to be, quote, reproduced, end quote, reconstructing its content by thought. We can appreciate better the ridiculous and ideologically marked nature of the advice given to English-speaking apprentice anthropologists in that little manual of instruction titled Notes and Queries on Anthropology. There's a footnote that I missed. Footnote, a man works, produces in his capacity as a social person, as a husband and father, brother and lineage mate, member of a clan, a village. Labor is not implemented apart from these existences as if it were a different existence. Quote, worker, end quote, is not a status in itself, nor, quote, labor, end quote, a true category of tribal economics, end quote. Marshall Solins. Sorry about that. End footnote. Quote, if the investigator has been trained in ordinary economic theory, but has no anthropological training, he should remember continually the importance of the social setting of the economic institutions he is studying. Otherwise, he will not grasp the value system upon which the economic organization depends. If he has had no economic training, he is recommended to study the fundamental principles expounded in one of the recognized economic textbooks. End quote. Notes and Queries on Anthropology, revised and rewritten by a committee of the Royal Anthropological Institution of Great Britain and Ireland. Routledge, 1960. Poorly concealed behind the look of innocent common sense are the contradictions of an empiricism that simultaneously declares and denies that it suffices to use, quote, ordinary economic theory, end quote, that of the, quote, recognized textbooks, end quote, in order to analyze original economic systems that cannot be conceived otherwise than in their inner relation with a definite, quote, social setting, end quote. It is clear that for conceiving this inner relation, quote, ordinary economic theory, end quote, even the theory of, quote, fundamental principles, end quote, does not offer an adequate instrument. Actually, and this is the radical originality of Marx's thought, which opposes it both to structuralism and to functionalism, Marxism assumes that this interrelation, which provides the underlying logic of the functioning of societies and of their history, is determined in the last analysis by the conditions of production and reproduction, the conditions of production and reproduction of their material basis, or to use his terminology, their mode of production. Marxism is not a philosophy of history or a, quote, model of history, end quote. History is not a concept that explains, but that one explains. Marxism is above all a theory of society, a hypothesis regarding the articulation of its internal levels and the specific hierarchical causality of each of these levels. Marxism assumes both the relative autonomy of social structures and their reciprocal relation in a specific way of referring back to a system of constraints, which determine in the last analysis, but which are never directly visible, and which express the conditions of production and reproduction of the material basis of social existence. Developing the theory of these structures, their articulations, their causality, and the conditions necessary for them to appear and to disappear, signify making history a science, and developing it as such, as provisional synthesis and conclusion, as, quote, reproduction of the concrete by means of thought, end quote. Marx. Footnote, quote, the concrete concept is concrete because it is a synthesis of many definitions, thus representing the unity of diverse aspects. The concrete concept appears therefore in reasoning as a summing up, a result, and not as a starting point, although it is the real point of origin, and thus also the point of origin of perception and imagination, end quote. Marx, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, end footnote. From the moment, however, when one accepts the assumption of the existence of necessary conditions for the appearance and disappearance of social structures, for their specific articulation and causality, history as reality can no longer be reduced to a succession of purely accidental events. Events have their own necessity, and accidents are seen to impose a necessity which ultimately does not depend on them, since it expresses the objective properties of social relations, properties of compatibility and incompatibility, which underlie the limited system of their possible transformations. There is no point in counterposing the internal causes of the transformations of societies to the external ones, since in the end it is the same unintentional properties of the social structure that are expressing themselves. It is pointless to bring forward as an objection to Marxism the dominance of kinship relations in this case, or politico-religious relations in that case. For Marxism does not deny these facts, declines to reduce structures one to another as epiphenomena of material life, but undertakes precisely to explain this dominance by seeking the reasons for it in specific determinations of different modes of production. Footnote, quote, in the estimation of, bracket, a critic of Marx, end bracket, my view that each special mode of production and the social relations corresponding to it, in short, that the economic structure of society is the real basis on which the juridical and political superstructure is raised, and to which definite social forms of thought correspond, that the mode of production determines the character of the social, political, and intellectual life generally. All this is very true for our own times, in which material interests preponderate, but not for the Middle Ages, in which Catholicism, nor for Athens and Rome, where politics reigned supreme. In the first place, it strikes me as an odd thing for anyone to suppose that these well-worn phrases about the Middle Ages and the ancient world are unknown to anyone else. This much, however, is clear, that the Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor the ancient world on politics. On the contrary, it is the mode in which they gained a livelihood that explains why here politics and there Catholicism played the chief part. ... On the other hand, Don Quixote long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight-errantry was compatible with all economic forms of society. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Marx gave only fragments of, quote, explanations of these different dominances, but Marx's thought is very clear and does not justify the criticisms made by Louis Dumont of his alleged utilitarian and Victorian conception of man. Quote, Marx shut himself within the confines of the modern view of man as an individual. ... Marx fully shared the outlook of the scholars of the Victorian age. End quote. And that quote is from, again, Louis Dumont. End footnote. Faced with these facts of dominance, British anthropology has proved incapable of doing anything more than repeat the dominant structures, quote, serve to, quote, integrate the various parts of the social whole, while failing to explain why it is that in one case kinship and in another politics or religion fulfilled the role of integrator. Quote, the British social anthropologists were less concerned about total configurations of cultural knowledge than about the functional integration of institutions which supported and maintained society. ... The key to the complex and beautiful unity of society was conceived to be its structure based on kin, marital and political relations. ... Here were hidden elaborate networks and subtle symmetries to be discovered, whereas subsistence activities were considered simple, undifferentiated, and boringly repetitive wherever one found them. End quote. Robert Netting, in an article titled The Ecological Approach in Cultural Study. And yet, on many occasions in their practical work, British anthropologists have contradicted this common doctrine of the older functionalism as against the neo-functionalism of cultural ecology, without drawing radical conclusions from having done so. Thus Leach in his work Political Systems of Highland Burma, when he analyzes the concepts of, quote, property and ownership, end quote, states, quote, the concepts which are discussed in the present section are of the utmost importance for my general arguments, for they provide the categories in terms of which social relations are linked with economic facts. In the last analysis, the power relations in any society must be based upon the control of real goods and the primary sources of production, but this Marxist generalization does not carry us very far. End quote. And that quote is from what? E.G. Firth. Wait, hold on. God damn it. That's from, actually, E. Leach. Can't remember the first name. E. Leach, Political Systems of Highland Burma. There's also a footnote in here that I missed. Footnote, E.G.R. Firth, in Primitive Polynesian Economy, quote, W.L. Wagner argued that the Merngen did not create a separate economic structure, but were dependent on their other institutions, primarily their kinship system, to regulate indirectly their technology and control their distribution and consumption of goods and services. End footnote. One cannot but wonder at the inconsequence of the conclusion. Pierret, by which the author shrugs off a hypothesis, quote, of the utmost importance, end quote, and application to, quote, any society, end quote, so as not to seem to be casting doubt on the non-Marxist theses of the functionalists. Much more seriously, however, R. Firth says in the preface to the second edition of his Primitive Polynesian Economy, quote, after publishing an account of the social structure, in particular the kinship structure, we the Ticopia, published in London 1936, in parentheses, I analyzed the economic structure of the society because so many social relationships were made more manifest in their economic content. Indeed, the social structure in particular, the political structure, was clearly dependent on specific economic relationships arising out of the system of control of resources. With these relationships, in turn, we link the religious activities and institutions of the society, end quote. Firth, Chapter 9. Among other valuable works by Anglo-American anthropologists on primitive economic systems should be mentioned Nadel's excellent book, Black Byzantium, devoted to the Nupe of Nigeria and the Nuer, by Evans Pritchard. End footnote. Throughout his work, Firth encouraged the development of economic anthropology, quote, for a deeper understanding of social conditions and structures in the communities the anthropologist studies, end quote. Footnote. In Primitive Polynesian Economy, Firth's evaluation of Herscovitz's work, Economic Anthropology, published in 1952, which was for a long time one of the few textbooks available to anthropologists on the subject, should be called to mind. Quote, Herskovitz examines material from a wide range of sources dealing with, quote, non-literate, end quote, economic systems. His treatment tends to be eclectic rather than rigorously theoretical, and it is difficult to discern what is the general framework of his analysis, end quote. Firth, in a book titled In Economics of the New Zealand Maori, end footnote. However, is not functionalism engaged in ridding itself of its inconsistencies and its traditional theoretical hesitations, thanks to the efforts of the American school known as that of, quote, cultural ecology, end quote? Footnote. See the article by Andrew P. Vida and Roy A. Rappaport, Ecology, Culture, and Non-Culture. End footnote. This school declares itself to be resolutely materialist and aims to reinterpret all human cultures on the basis of the material conditions of the adaptation of man to definite environments. Footnote, quote, the tendency in social anthropology has been to study societies as if they were isolated, self-sufficient systems, subsisting on thin air with no visible roots in the soil. The guiding principle, derived in large part from Durkheim and more explicitly from Radcliffe Brown, has been that social facts require sociological explanations, end quote. In The Family of a State in Africa, edited by R.F. Gray and P.H. Gulliver. End footnote. Every society is studied as a subsystem of a wider totality, the ecological system within which that society lies, and the functioning and conditions of reproduction of this ecological system are analyzed by means of systems theory and communication theory, feedback mechanisms, entropy, etc. The whole of functionalism seems to have recast in its orientation materialistic, its method, modern systems theory, and its theoretical possibilities and aspirations, comparison of societies and construction of a multilinear schema of social evolution. Are we not here in the theoretical universe, if not of Marx himself, then at least of Marxism, as Marxism is generally understood and practiced? I do not here propose to draw up a survey, even a provisional survey of the works of the anthropologists who adhere to the doctrine of culperceptively, to the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Oh, skipped a line. There we are. I'm glad I figured that out. It was driving me nuts. I do not here propose to draw up a survey, even a provisional survey, of the works of the anthropologists who adhere to the doctrine of cultural materialism. Robert Netting has recently done this very firmly and perceptively by compiling a list of the positive discoveries that were quickly made as soon as detailed study was undertaken of the ecological environment and conditions of production of the peoples who live by hunting and food gathering. Parenthesis, Richard Lee, Devore, Stewart, in parenthesis, the Indians of the Northwest Coast, parenthesis, Suttles, in parenthesis, the pastoral societies of East Africa, parenthesis, Gulliver, Deschler, Dyson, Hudson, in parenthesis, and slash and burn cultivators, parenthesis, Gertz, Roy, Rappaport, in parenthesis, confronted by facts, the theses that had been repeated over and over again by, quote, cultural anthropology, and quote, in which every anthropology student had accepted as gospel truth, gradually collapsed. The, quote, hardship, and quote, of the life of the hunters and food gatherers, the potlatch, quote, excesses, end quote, of the Northwest Coast Indians, the, quote, cattle complex, end quote, and, quote, love for their cows, end quote, of the African herdsmen, and the, quote, irrational practices, end quote, of slash and burn agriculture. Footnote, see the collection of articles by A.P. Vida, Environment and Cultural Behavior, published in 1969, end footnote. To the work of the anthropologist must be added that of archaeologists such as Braidwood, Flannery, McNeish, etc., who have devoted themselves since the 1950s to reconstituting in minute detail the ecological conditions of existence of the pre-Neolithic populations of Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, and have transformed our knowledge of the processes of domestication of plants and animals, and of the appearance of new economic and social systems, based on agricultural and stock breeding. Here, too, an old established and respected idea, that of the, quote, Neolithic revolution, and, quote, child, I think it's VG Child, I'm not sure, but he's like an important person who's like done work in anthropology from or archaeology, I think, even from a Marxist approach. Here too, an old established and respected idea, that of the, quote, Neolithic revolution, in quote, parenthesis, child, in parenthesis, had to be called in question and profoundly revised. Footnote, see P.J. Ucko and C.W. Dimbleby, The Domestication and Exploitation of Plants and Animals, published in 1969, and the collection of articles edited by Stuart Struver, Prehistoric Agriculture, published in 1971, and footnote. It was inevitable that these positive results would be obtained as soon as a systematic effort was devoted to analyzing essential aspects of the functioning of primitive or ancient societies which have been dogmatically neglected or wrongly handled, except by brilliant exceptions like Malinowski, Firth, and Evans Pritchard, on the pretext that they were, quote, undifferentiated and boringly repetitive, end quote. Nevertheless, what is called the ecological approach, as soon as it tries to become a general theory of social life and history, comes to grief insofar as, on such essential points as the causality of the economy and/or of the environment, the nature of the functional relations between social structures, and the driving forces of the evolution of systems, it relies upon the dogmas of vulgar materialism, which ultimately prove to be not merely helpless in face of the idealism that is widespread in the social sciences, but even to justify this idealism and contribute to reproducing this idealism. Let me briefly review some of the weaknesses of this new form of vulgar materialism. The economy is a system of social relations between men engendered in and from the process of producing their material conditions of existence, is reduced to technology and the relation between men and nature. Instead of determination in the last analysis by the economy, we have determination in the last analysis by the ecological environment to which man adapts man's self, by inventing the appropriate techniques. Social structures are seen as so many means that are functionally necessary for this ecological adaptation. Footnote: I refer the reader to the cuttingly written debunking paper by Jonathan Friedman titled Marxism, Structuralism, and Vulgar Materialism, published with the Congress of the American Anthropological Association in 1971. End footnote. Their hidden, latent rationality lies in providing adaptive, selective advantages which are disguised under forms that appear to be irrational, non-economic, etc. Thus, Marvin Harris, wishing, so to speak, to, quote, desacralize, end quote, the sacred cattle of India, writes, quote, I have written this paper because I believe the irrational, non-economic, and exotic aspects of the Indian cattle complex are greatly overemphasized at the expense of the rational, economic, and mundane interpretations. Insofar as the beef-eating taboo helps discourage growth of beef-producing industries, it is part of an ecological adjustment which maximizes rather than minimizes on the calorie and protein output of the productive process, end quote. M. Harris, in an article titled The Cultural Ecology of India's Sacred Cattle, published in Current Anthropology, Volume 7, Number 1, February 1966. The same writer's critique of historical materialism see the same writer's critique of historical materialism in The Rise of Anthropological Theory, published in 1968. At footnote. Here we recognize empirical materialism, the quote, economism, end quote, that reduces all social structures to nothing but a phenomenon of the economy, which is itself reduced through technique to a function of adaptation to the environment. With this view of the matter, the problems presented by the dominance and plurality of functions of kinship relations or politico-religious relations remain inaccessible to materialist analysis. It is impossible to conceive the specific articulation of structures, and reciprocal causality is reduced to probabilist correlation, and history to a series of events of greater or less frequency. Quote, dependent as we are on the unfolding of the natural continuum of events, our generalizations must be couched in probabilistic terms derived from the observation of the frequencies with which predicted or retrodicted events occur. End quote. M. Harris, The Rise of Anthropological Theory. Actually, as Levi-Strauss had already commented, invoking the secret rationality of adaptive advantages in order to explain distinct forms of social organization leads one very quickly into either truism or absurdities. Footnote. Levi-Strauss, quote, to say that a society functions is a truism, but to say that everything in a society functions is an absurdity, end quote. End footnote. As soon as society exists, society functions, and it is tautological to say that a variable is adaptive because that variable fulfills a necessary function in the total system. Quote, proof that a certain trait or cultural arrangement has positive economic value is not an adequate explanation of its existence or even of its presence. The problematic of adaptive advantage does not specify a uniquely correct answer. As principle of causality in general, and economic performance in particular, adaptive advantage is indeterminate, stipulating grossly what is impossible, but rendering suitable anything that is possible, end quote. Marshall Solins, in an article, Economic Anthropology and Anthropological Economics, published in Social Sciences Information in October 1969. See Solins' essays in Stone Age Economics, published in 1972. I am grateful to Mr. Solins for having allowed me to read the manuscript of this book. End footnote. We see then that a materialism like this is unable to explain the reasons why, the fundamental necessity of what exists, i.e. the reasons why the history of societies that are not always completely, quote, integrated totalities, but totalities whose unity is the provisionally stable effect of a structural compatibility that enables different structures to reproduce those structures' selves until those structures reach the point at which the internal and external dynamic of these systems forbids this totality to go on existing as such. Quote, new materialism, end quote, seems analytically innocent of any concern for contradiction, although it sometimes figures itself as a client of Marxism minus the dialectical materialism. So it is mindful of the barriers opposed to productive forces by established cultural organizations, each congealed by its adaptive advantages in some state of fractional effectiveness, end quote. Footnote, this does not mean that the analysis of functional relations between elements of social structure and other social structures, is not a scientific task. See P. Collins' article, Functional Analyses, in the Symposium, Man, Culture, and Animals, edited by A. Leeds and A. P. Vita, published in 1965. End footnote. The limitations and failures to which functionalism is subject are thus still due to the same theoretical basis, to the axioms of a reductionist and abstract empiricism, whether this be idealistic or materialistic. What then is in relation to history and to the problem of the relation between economy and society are the positions taken up by Levi-Strauss, who, as we have seen, rejects from the outset empiricism in all its forms. For Claude Levi-Strauss, quote, it is tedious as well as useless, to amass arguments to prove that all societies are in history and change. That this is so is patent, end quote. Levi-Strauss. History is not merely a, quote, cold, end quote, history, in which, quote, societies which create the minimum of that disorder which the physicists call, quote, entropy, end quote, tend to remain indefinitely in their initial state, end quote. Levi-Strauss. It is also made up of these, quote, non-recurrent chains of events whose effects accumulate to produce economic and social upheavals, end quote. Levi-Strauss. In order to explain these fundamental historical transformations, Levi-Strauss accepts, quote, the undoubted primacy of infrastructures, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Quote, I do not at all mean to suggest that ideological transformations give rise to social transformations. Only the reverse, in fact, is true. Men's conception of the relations between nature and culture is a function of modifications of their own social relations. ... We are, however, merely studying the shadows on the wall of the cave. ... End quote. Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss himself states, quote, "It is to this theory of superstructures scarcely touched upon by Marx that I hope to make a contribution." End quote. Levi-Strauss. One cannot but note that this theory of society, of the, quote, law of order, end quote, of the relation between economy and society, has vanished when Levi-Strauss, in the conclusion to Du Mille u Cent, sees in the fundamental historical upheaval at the end of which, quote, "At the frontiers of Greek thought, mythology gave way to a philosophy that emerges as the preliminary condition for scientific reflection, ... A historical occurrence whose whole significance lies in having happened in that place at that time. An historical occurrence whose whole significance lies in having happened in that place at that time." End quote. Levi-Strauss. History, even though endowed with a, quote, law of order, end quote, is thus deprived of any necessity, and the births of Western philosophy and science are seen as mere accidental events. Quote, "Neither here nor there was the transition necessary, and if history retains its position in the front rank, this position is the one that rightfully belongs to irreducible contingency." End quote. Levi-Strauss. The Claude Levi-Strauss, who had put as epigraph to his elementary structures of kinship Tyler's statement that, quote, "The tendency of modern inquiry is more and more towards the conclusion that if law is anywhere, law is everywhere," end quote. Levi-Strauss. Thus finds himself in the end in agreement with the empiricism that sees in history a succession of accidental events. Quote, "To go back to ethnology, it was one of us, E.R. Leach, who commented that, quote, the evolutionists have never discussed in detail, still less observed, what actually happened when a society in stage A changed into a society at stage B. It was merely argued that all stage B societies must somehow have evolved out of stage A societies." End quote. Levi-Strauss. We are back at the position held by functionalist empiricism. Quote, "History is concerned with changes, ethnology with structures," end quote. And this because changes, quote, "processes are not analytical objects, but the particular way in which a temporality is experienced by a subject, end quote. Levi-Strauss. An empiricist view that is profoundly contrary to the thesis of the, quote, law of order, end quote, of social changes which Levi-Strauss took from Marx. Thus we see before us a theoretical method which, underneath the apparently harmonious character of the author's work, is based upon two opposed systems of theoretical principles, one of which affirms the necessity of historical transformations, while the other affirms their irreducibly contingent nature. Incidentally, Marx did not contrast necessity and contingency as two irreducible realities. The question arises whether Levi-Strauss's theoretical method leads necessarily from the first conclusion to the second. What he was aiming to do in Elementary Structures of Kinship, the book Elementary Structures of Kinship, was to explain the reasons for the prohibition of incest and the different marriage systems which constitute modalities of this, or at least systems with elementary structures, that is, systems which, quote, while defining all members of a society as relatives, divide them into two categories, viz. Possible spouses and prohibited spouses, unquote. Levi-Strauss. From this standpoint, the system prescribing marriages between cross cousins and prescribing marriages between parallel cousins became particularly good examples of these elementary structures of kinship, and study of them constitute a special and crucial part of the analysis. The method used consists first, negatively, of eliminating, quote, all historical speculation, all research into origins, and all attempts to reconstruct a hypothetical order in which institutions succeeded one another, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Not that for Levi-Strauss the different features of a kinship system could not have different origins and their own histories, but they never form entities that can be isolated and treated as independent of the rest, and they are never merely juxtaposed, but always combined in a specific way, forming a, quote, structural phenomenon, end quote. Levi-Strauss. The method thus consisted positively of treating in every case the rules of marriage, the nomenclatures, the systems of privileges and of prohibitions as, quote, indissociable aspects of one and the same reality, end quote. Levi-Strauss. And showing that this reality was the actual structure of the systems under examination. This is how Levi-Strauss showed, in opposition to Fraser. Am I recording? Yes. This was how Levi-Strauss showed, in opposition to Fraser, that in the case of cross-cousin systems, parallel cousins are excluded from marriage, quote, for the same reason, end quote, that cross-cousins are approved. Prohibition and prescription are effects of one and the same principle, which, though it shows itself particularly clearly in the case of the marriage of cross-cousins, is, quote, present, end quote, in all systems, the principle of reciprocity. But this principle means one thing only, namely the fundamental nature of marriage as a, quote, form of exchange, end quote. The prohibition of incest then appears not as an arbitrary or mysterious rule of social life, but as one of the conditions necessary for marriage to take place as a socially regulated exchange of women between groups. The women that one group forbids itself to marry are available for marriage to other groups and reciprocally. Seen in this way, the practices of endogamy and exogamy are clarified, together with the existence of dual organizations and different systems of kinship, since these are based on a form of exchange, whether this be restricted or generalized. Hence the very plan of Levi-Strauss's work, which leads us from the simple forms of restricted exchange to the complex forms of generalized exchange, come to a halt at the threshold of the, quote, complex structures, end quote, of kinship, which, quote, limit themselves to defining the circle of relatives and leave the determination of the spouse to other mechanisms, economic or psychological, end quote. Levi-Strauss. A huge table of, quote, forms of kinship systems is gradually built up, all being linked together in an immense system of transformations, a sort of Mendeleev's table of kinship relations, from the kinship systems of the tribes of Australia and Melanesia to others found in Southeast Asia, China, Tibet, and India, and stopping for the time being at the door of the American, African, and European systems. Two results of this theoretical work seem to me to be fundamental. On the one hand, an order has been discovered in a vast number of kinship systems that appeared to have little in common, and that belonged to societies which in most cases had no contact with each other. And this order of forms is an order of transformations. On the other, the analysis that has brought out the presence of an invariant in all these varied forms, the fact that marriage is an exchange of women, that kinship relations are relations between groups before they are relations between individuals, and that these social relations employ different forms of the same principle, namely reciprocity and exchange. Levi-Strauss is thus brought to light a, quote, fundamental fact of social and mental reality, end quote. A fact that is at the same time a norm of all social life, and which, because it is present in every form of kinship relations, appears as a meta-historical, quote, fact principle, end quote, which must be found on pain of falling into the traps of historicism and empiricism. Quote, what we regard as the means of escaping from cultural history, he, bracket, Fraser, in bracket, attempted to interpret as cultural history. The very thing we see as a necessary condition of society, la condition de la société, he sought to analyze into stages of social evolution, end quote. Levi-Strauss. In my view, matrimonial exchange is a condition rather than the condition of society. It is, of course, always possible to read Levi-Strauss in an idealist spirit, interpreting this meta-historical condition as a supra-historical condition with its source in a reality or in principles transcending history. This would mean denying that Levi-Strauss has himself emphasized with the greatest clearness that this meta-historical condition is nothing to do with either, quote, irrational events, end quote, or human, quote, intentions, end quote, or with the, quote, design of the legislation, end quote, but is merely, quote, the experimental discovery of the immanence of a relation, end quote, Levi-Strauss, between men that is unintentional and which makes of them a society. Why then does Levi-Strauss's structural analysis, although it does not destroy history or tear itself away from history, yet never, quote, meet, end quote, history in its concrete diversity and reality? My analysis enables me to answer this question precisely. Structural analysis does not meet history because, from the outset, it has separated analysis of the form of kinship relations from the analysis of their functions. It is not that these functions are denied, but they are never explored as such. As a result, the problem of the real articulation of kinship relations and the other social structures that characterize concrete historically determined societies, concrete realities within which Levi-Strauss limits himself to distinguishing the, quote, formal system, end quote, of kinship relations to be studied in itself and compared with other, quote, forms of kinship, similar or contrasting, is never analyzed either. Of course, Levi-Strauss is not unaware of these problems, but Levi-Strauss has not tackled these problems. And yet these are fundamental problems, the solution of which will enable us not merely to understand these are fundamental problems, the solution of which will enable us not merely to understand the form, but also the content of social relations, the conditions of for their appearance and for their disappearance, and so the history of mankind through history. There's a footnote that I missed. It's a quote from Levi-Strauss. Quote, actually, there is nothing in the exchange of women faintly resembling a reasoned solution to an economic problem, although it can acquire this function in societies which have already learnt in some way that in some other way, what purchase and sale are, end quote. Levi-Strauss. I do not think that kinship relations acquire economic functions only when an economy of buying and selling, a market economy, has been established. End footnote. Thus, in connection, thus in connection with the, quote, correlation established by Murdoch between patrilineal institutions and the highest levels of culture, end quote, G.P. Murdoch, Levi-Strauss says, quote, it is true that in societies where political power takes precedence over other forms of organization, the duality which would result from the masculinity of political authority and the matrilineal character of dissent could not subsist. Consequently, societies attaining this level of political organization tend to generalize the paternal right, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Footnote. See the article by G.P. Murdoch titled Correlation of Matrilineal and Patrilineal Institutions, published in Studies in the Science of Society, presented to A.J. Keller in 1937. See on this subject the conclusion of H. Driver and K. Schuessler. In their article, Correlational Analysis of Murdoch's 1957 ethnographic sample, published in American Anthropologist, 1967. End footnote. A structural morphology without analysis of functions, without, quote, physiology, end quote, is incomplete, and only joint development of these two fields of investigation can enable us to pose correctly the problem of the transformation and evolution of systems, the problem of history. Quote, a functional system, e.g. a kinship system, can never be interpreted in an integral fashion by diffusionist hypotheses. The system is bound up with the total structure of the society employing it, and consequently its nature depends more on the intrinsic characteristics of such a society than on cultural contacts and migrations. End quote. Levi-Strauss. It is therefore necessary to take up the task where it has been abandoned and go beyond structural analysis of the forms of kinship or the compilation of a formal grammar of the myths of the American Indians. In my article titled Myth et Histoire, I don't know how to say history. It looks like it translates as what? Myths and history, reflections on the foundations of something savage. Pensée sauvage. I don't know. Anyway, I showed that Levi-Strauss, in the same way as Levi-Strauss had brought out, through his study of kinship forms, a relation that is immanent in society, an unvarying feature of kinship, namely the fact that marriage is a, quote, exchange, end quote, has also brought out through his study of the myths of the American Indians a meta-historical invariant, namely thought in the savage state, i.e. the formal structure of thoughts as, quote, a direct expression in the structure of the mind, and behind the mind probably of the brain, end quote. Levi-Strauss. At the same time, Levi-Strauss has brought out in great detail all the elements of ecological, economic, and social reality which are transposed in myths and make these myths no longer thought in the savage state, but the thought of savages, i.e. the thought of men living in historically determined social relations. Once again, what is lacking is analysis of the precise functions of these forms of thought, of the articulation of these forms of ideology with the other levels of social reality, and of the conditions of their transformation. What is lacking above all is a theory of the foundations and forms of the fetishization of social relations, of the necessity of this fetishization. Quote, every history of religion even that fails to take account of this material basis is uncritical. it is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of the mystic creations of religion than conversely it is to develop from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestialized forms of these relations. The latter method is the only materialistic and therefore only scientific one. End quote. And that's from Marx. To go further than a structural morphology means, therefore, trying to account for the forms, functions, mode of articulation, and conditions of transformation of the social structures within the concrete societies studied by the historian and the anthropologist. It is precisely in order to accomplish this complex task, which presupposes a combination of several theoretical methods, that Marx's hypothesis of the determination, in the last analysis, of the forms and the evolution of societies by the conditions of production and reproduction of their material life is needed as the central hypothesis. And I have shown that despite appearances and assertions to the contrary, it is to this central hypothesis that we are inevitably brought by rigorous functionalism and structuralism when these try to penetrate more deeply into the logic of the facts and societies they analyze. From this standpoint, is there a footnote here? Footnote. Marx in the famous sixth chapter of Capital, long unpublished, which has recently appeared in French, quote, "My conception differs fundamentally from that of the bourgeois economists who, prisoners of capitalist conceptions, see indeed how production takes place within capitalist relations, but not how these relations are themselves produced, at the same time creating the material conditions for their own dissolution, abolishing with the same stroke their historical justification as a necessary form of economic development and production of social wealth." End quote. Marx. End footnote. From this standpoint, it will no longer be possible to go on counterposing anthropology to history or to sociology as three fetishized separate domains, nor to present economic anthropology or economic theory as mere specialized lines of research belatedly added to other specialized domains that are more advanced. What is involved in the study of societies on the basis of their mode of production and reproduction is the complete and radical reworking of all the theoretical methods that have been developed in the process of man's cognition in his social life and his historical evolution. What is involved is the crisis, latent or overt, which prevails today in the humane sciences, the problem of their unity and their progress. The question of the, quote, rationality, end quote, of economic and social systems is thus at the same time the critical question of the, quote, rationality, end quote, of the various theories that have been put forward by the humane sciences, together with the forms of action and the objectives of the social groups representing the different economic and social systems that confront each other on the scene of history. There is thus no way of, quote, disengaging, end quote, science from history, thought from action, and a theoretical revolution in the humane sciences will necessarily furnish a theory that will be more effective for revolutionary practice. The end. Thank you all for listening.